Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our rescheduled webinar all about horizon scanning. I'm delighted to be joined today by Steve Fowler, who's been with Risk Evolves, I think since day one, Steve, haven't we? And you and I have worked together many years before that as well. Before I hand over to Steve to go through a little bit more about horizon scanning and how you manage risk in an ever-changing world at the moment, a couple of pieces of housekeeping for you. Just to make you aware, this session is being recorded and will be available later on the Risk Evolves website and also on the Risk Evolves YouTube channel. If you'd like to ask any questions, then there should be a questions box that you can see on your GoToWebinar control panel. Please pop them in there, and we've got plenty of time to ask Steve any questions as we go through the day. When we get to the end of the session, there will be a questionnaire that's sent over to you just to get some feedback on how you found the session, whether you found it useful, and also as well to give us an indication of whether there's anything else that you'd like to see in the future. And then finally, we've also got a handout that you can download, which is a copy of the slides that Steve will be going through. Steve's included some really good references that you can go and look at that will help with the horizon scanning process. So before I hand over to Steve, very briefly as well, who are Risk Evolves? What do we do? Risk Evolves are a governance, risk and compliance management consultancy company, and basically we love everything that you can do with compliance, whether it be ISO certifications, whether it be ESG, whether it be information security, data privacy, etc., etc., and the list of things that we deliver to customers are there. As you've already understood, today we're going to talk about risk management. So Steve, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. This webinar has been rescheduled, and I did refer to a black swan, didn't I? So it's probably worthwhile kicking off with what a black swan is.
Well, thanks, Helen, and hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Hopefully it won't take all day. We are scheduled for
30 minutes.
half an hour maximum, so speed it up, Steve. Yeah, let's start with the black swan. Well, there's a picture of black swan. It's not a white swan covered in crude oil after a tanker spillage, although we could have included that in our list of black swans. Yeah, this comes from the book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, who is an American economist and academic. And the book is called The Black Swan. He spent a lot of time working in the banking industry, and if we think back, 10, 15 years, the whole Western banking industry crashed, didn't it? And everyone said, well, who saw that coming? Now, Nassim likened this to the discovery of black swans when white European explorers first went to Australia. They saw these birds and they didn't recognize them as swans because they were black. And it took some anatomists to work out, well, actually, it's just a white swan that's black because it's in a different part of the world. And that term black swan has been used since then as a way of describing something that we don't expect. We don't see it because we're not expecting to see it. Well, of course, we live in quite a benign world, don't we? Not much changes from year to year. You know, most parts of the world, people get slightly wealthier. Warfare tends to decrease, and we don't have problems with major illnesses. Except none of that is true, and it's taken, you know, one or two key events, shall we call them, over the last 3 years to bring this home to all of us in a very, very serious way. And if you read the media, particularly newspapers in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world, including the UK, one could be mistaken for thinking, well, no one saw any of these things coming. However, I've got a list of 5 things on the left-hand side of the screen there. Ukraine, well, did nobody see that coming? Surely Russia invaded Crimea only, 5 to 10 years ago. So surely it was in the realms of possibility that a special military operation in the east of the main part of Ukraine, it's quite possible that could have happened. So nobody seeing it coming? Well, maybe they were looking in the wrong place. Brexit. I was reading in newspapers at the weekend, and this is only relevant if you come from a UK perspective or a mainland European perspective, but Brexit obviously refers to the UK leaving the EU, which has now happened. There were two sides to that debate, the so-called Brexiteers and the so-called, loyalists who wanted to remain loyal to remaining in the EU. But the Brexiteers described the other mob with the term of Project Fear. All the arguments that came out from the EU side at the time of the debate revolved around the impact it would have on us in the UK. And the Brexiteers used the words Project Fear. In other words, this is all made up stuff. It's not going to happen. We're now finding that actually most of what was described in Project Fear is actually happening or has already happened. So nobody's seeing it happening. Nobody's seeing it coming. The impact of Brexit? Well, maybe not. COVID-19, well, yeah, a lot of people refer to this as a black swan, but basically it isn't. It was in the 2008 UK National Risk Register. Obviously, the word COVID wasn't there, but non-flu based pandemics. And climate change. When I left university in the 1970s, I decided I wanted to become an environmental chemist because everyone was talking about climate change. Here we are 50 years on, and everyone's still talking about climate change. This is not something invented by a few environmentalists in the last 2 or 3 years. It's been around for a long time. So, just taking the first four on that list, these are all issues that if you looked in the right places and you took a skeptical view of the world, you could think, right, okay, stuff is happening and we need to react to it. But we get lulled into a false sense of security by everyday concerns, and therefore we don't act on things. So how do we deal with this changing world? Next slide, Helen. Yeah, as we've said in the first bullet point here, we're living in a world of increased uncertainty. I think that's pretty obvious. We have to anticipate what might happen more quickly. We basically need to get quicker at this stuff. There's no point acting on a disease like COVID. Once it happens, you've got to act in advance. Actually, a good bit of that has happened. Some people will say, well, how come the vaccines got rolled out so quickly? Well, it's because pharmaceutical chemists were working on a generic vaccine engine, they call it, something that can be plugged in to an appropriate virus when the virus comes along to speed up the whole process of developing new vaccines. If that work hadn't been carried out in advance, we'd still be waiting for a vaccine for COVID now. And new crises will emerge before we fix the old ones. I wonder how many of us 2 years ago were thinking about Crimea, food shortages, and fuel shortages in the Western world. We probably weren't. And I can guarantee that in another 2 years, we'll all be talking about something else that most of us probably haven't thought of. So we've got to get used to the fact that new crises do emerge in this world. And we can't afford to deal with things sequentially. In Western Europe, most countries are suffering a cost of living crisis at the moment. There's no one reason for that. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sanctions on Russia have an impact. If you cut off your fuel supply from Russia, don't be surprised if the price of fuel goes up. If you cut off grain supplies from Ukraine, don't be surprised if food prices go up. But also, one of the main impacts of Brexit in the UK was it was known that food prices would go up as a result of Brexit. But for those who voted for Brexit, that was a price worth paying at the time. Trouble is, we're now suffering from the combined effect of Brexit and fuel prices as a result of Ukraine, and a lot more convoluted processes for everything as a result of COVID, hence a cost of living crisis. We can't afford to deal with these things individually. We've got to look at the combined impact of all of them. And we have to get better at mitigating the consequences from each of them. All of which is fine, but I haven't actually told you how we can do that. Well, let's move on to the next slide. The answer to part of it is this process called horizon scanning. Now, there's no one formal definition of horizon scanning. I've given one here, an organized and formal process of gathering, analyzing, and disseminating value-added information to support decision-making. Interestingly, whilst Helen referred to today's session as risk management, I've carefully not used the word risk there at all. And it's because I come from the school of thought that what is risk management? It's a process to support decision making. If it becomes anything else, it's sort of become an aim in itself rather than something that can be embedded in any organization. So all horizon scanning is just a way of thinking about the unthinkable in advance so you can do something about it. So you're not sat there watching TV, watching the war evolve, thinking, this is going to affect me. I should have done something about that weeks ago, months ago, years ago. So how do we actually implement a process of horizon scanning? Next slide, Helen. Now, this is a great slide. It's one of those slides you can use for almost anything in the whole world. It's just a simple process. So understanding the context, understanding what impacts the organization. And for those who've been on webinars, seminars, training courses on risk management, you'll know that we always start with your own organization and what could impact the organization. Horizon scanning is no different. Start with what matters, because if it's not going to affect your organization, you need to think widely about that. You need to think properly about it. But if it's not going to affect the organization, don't spend time on it. I'm sure you've got plenty of other things to do. Identify gaps in your knowledge. So let's think back to the early year 2000s. So that's what, 20 years ago. There was the attack on the Twin Towers in New York by Al-Qaeda, and people turned around and said, well, nobody saw that coming. Well, actually, they had actually tried to blow up the Twin Towers only 6 months earlier with a car bomb in the basement. So nobody saw that coming. Maybe no one saw the use of aircraft to carry out what the car bomb had failed to achieve. But an attack on the buildings, yeah, with a judicious bit of horizon scanning, people should have seen it coming and should have therefore been prepared for that. Challenging the status quo. We have this culture in a lot of parts of the world that, the majority are always right. And in many ways, that's a fine thing to have. In the Western world, we call it democracy. But actually, let's just stop for a moment. Just because most people believe things doesn't necessarily make it right. It makes their opinion, a large group of people got one opinion, but that opinion may not be informed by the knowledge that you need to properly question the issue that's being dealt with. And usually we call that not democracy, but we call it running a business. Most businesses aren't run on democratic lines. They're run on the basis that the team at the top know what they're doing, seek out the information, scan the environment to make the right decisions. So challenging the status quo. And that means challenging the majority in some cases. You might be the one person in the room that has the added piece of information that says, but have you thought about that? Using that information and communicating it well is a way of changing everybody else's mind. It's a hard thing to do, but the people who really succeed in life are those that tend to be quite good at doing that. And then, next bullet point, building consensus amongst stakeholders. So great to have the right answer, But nobody wants to be the person sat in the corner who says, well, I knew that was going to happen, but nobody believed me. You've got to have that ability to build consensus amongst the people who really matter, because otherwise, what value do you have in your life, really? You can get quite philosophical about this. And then once you've built the consensus and you know that something's coming down the tracks and you need to do something about it, actually do something about it. Identify the key policy choices you need to make and the key trade-offs you need to make. Again, referring back to risk management, risk management's all about trade-offs. You can't deal with every risk, short-term or long-term, affecting your organization. You've got to look at the choices that you make. And one of the sad things about not dealing with some of these black swan issues is that many of us have made policy choices that focus on the short term when really we should have focused on the long term, less likely but more severe things that potentially can impact us. Creating a resilient and adaptable strategy, everybody says that. That's probably the subject for another webinar at some point, Helen, to talk about what do we mean by resilience and what do we mean about adaptability. But it's ensuring that your organization is not sunk by the next thing to come down the tracks, and ensuring that you're able to move quickly enough to respond to the next thing. And obviously the final point in this key steps chart is to mobilize for action and take the action. It should be an iterative process. So after taking action, you go back to looking at the main forces impacting the organization. And don't think it's all negative. There are opportunities here as well. In founding, well, he didn't actually found, he took over Tesla. Elon Musk had identified that environmental sustainability was going to become really important. So he got ahead of the rest of the auto industry by building up Tesla and launching vehicles ahead of the established players. So by seeing the black swan coming before anyone else, he's created a business opportunity for his organization. A lot of, people would say, yeah, but he was on drugs and he was mad and all sorts of things. But he does have this uncanny ability to see what is coming before other people see it. And that's actually a good skill to have if you're running a business. Next slide. Okay, a quick run through what sort of tools you use to scan horizons, to look to the future. Forecasting, in other words, taking data from the past and using that data to try and predict what's going to happen going forward. That data can be both quantitative and it can also be qualitative data. There are some analytical thinking tools. The two are basically the same. STEEPLE stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical. PESTLE is all the same words in a different order, minus the word ethical. So basically, you hear, amongst economist strategists, these referred to, they're just ways of helping management teams to think about all the pressures that could be coming to impact an organization rather than just the obvious ones. It's a checklist, if you like. Trend analysis related to forecasting, again, using maths to look at the past in order to try and work out what can happen in the future. Scenario planning, developed by the US military in the 1950s as a way of waging war in a more effective way. One of the interesting things about war situations is nobody really knows what's going to happen, and therefore you need to be able to react to a number of potential scenarios. Scenario planning is just a simple way of saying, right, okay, if this happens, and this is most likely to happen, then this is going to be our strategy. And that's how most businesses plan their strategies. But scenario planning says, however, if this happens instead, we're going to change our strategy to something else. Or if that happens instead, we're going to change our strategy to something completely different. I still, even though this has been around as a technique for 70 years, I still don't see much evidence that most businesses take a scenario planning approach to their business planning. But it's a great way of building in some thinking about, what is there out there on the horizon and how can we react to it. And stress testing, often used in the financial services industry, again, it's a financial planning tool, a lot of maths involved to say, right, okay, so many loans go bad, will the bank go out of business? Any of these tools are better implemented using a neutral facilitator so that you don't fall foul of areas like groupthink and sort of assuming that you're going to get everything right. Like all of these things, there's a huge amount of detail behind the scenes, and that's the subject of several further webinars, I'd suggest.
It is. And I think, Steve, one of the things I like about these tools is for anybody on the call that's got an ISO standard, so ISO 9001, 27001, etc. There are a whole plethora of tools out there, standards out there. Each of these tools is really relevant to how you manage risk within each of those standards. So, for example, when we work with clients on risk workshops to understand risk within the business, whether it be quality, whether it be information security, etc., we use analytical tools such as Pestle and Steeple to try and tease out the risks that all businesses know they've got, but they may not be able to actually articulate them and quantify them. And similarly, scenario planning, if you've got 22301, the business continuity standard, or even 27001, the information security standard, lots of scenario planning there from what happens from a business continuity perspective. So I see some of these tools in use, but you're absolutely right. Do we see them as tools that are regularly used from the kit bag? Probably not.
Yeah. In my experience, the things that work best are simply getting people in a room with a neutral facilitator. That's really important. Telling the boss to shut up if he can. But yeah, what I mean by that is ensuring that everyone in the room is able to contribute and isn't going to be struck down for thinking the impossible. Because this is a time when you need to hear from everyone. You need all the wild and wacky ideas, because actually one of them out there might be something that can sink your business, but it might be one that can make your fortune going forward.
Right. I'm going to move you along, Steve, in the interest of time, because I also want to make sure that we pick up any questions as well. So this next slide, really busy slide, isn't it? And again, it's in the handout if anybody wants to download it. Emerging Risk Radar, love this, absolutely love this.
Yeah, this is just a way of, you worked out what could potentially hit your organization, which ones are likely to have an impact on your organization as opposed to someone else's organization. And you can plot them in a sort of spidery type diagram. Look at the things around the edges as well as things towards the center. In theory, those towards the center are more likely to have a more severe impact, but think about the less likely things as well, because that's where the COVIDs of this world and the Ukraines of this world lurk. Also think about the speed at which a risk can potentially impact. Thing about both COVID and Ukraine is that they both hit quite quickly. So there was no time to prepare after you'd realized it was going to happen. The preparation's got to happen in advance. And also think about combinations of risk. Cost of living crisis in the West is a result of a number of things happening together. Next slide. Next slide is just a list of a few sources I've come across of organizations that can help for free. There's a huge amount out there on the web that can help you think about what could happen to your organization going forward. And just on to my final slide before I hand to Helen. Of course, we started with communication at the beginning and we'll finish with communication at the end. There is no point in doing all this work unless you can get someone to believe you. So key points from this list, and I won't run through them all. Put it in a context, distill meaning from chaos. So, you know, you need to help your senior execs think about why the issue that you want to talk about really matters, and be credible and believed. You know, make sure that people think, right, okay, I'm listening to Steve and Helen here, and actually, from what they've said before, I know that they're not going to scare us witless over something that doesn't matter, so we better put our phones down and listen to this. So you've got to be credible and believe, because otherwise there's no point in doing anything. And whatever you put forward, don't just put it out there, but use it to create a platform for action, whether that be prepare for a disaster or actually use the potential disaster as an opportunity. You know, a lot of organizations made a lot of money through COVID, some in an ethical way and a lot in an unethical way, but they use the crisis as a platform for action. So like the dog and the cat here, learn to communicate with each other. And back to you, Helen.
No, absolutely brilliant run through, Steve. And I agree with you, Steve. Communication is absolutely key. One of the things that you need to learn when communicating risk in an organisation is not to cry wolf. It's absolutely to go in with, I agree with you, being credible and believed is key. Go in with information that backs up what you're saying. So perhaps it's coming from the World Economic Forum, perhaps it's coming from the ILO, perhaps it's coming from all sorts of different bodies. There is lots of information out there that as professionals we have to distill into meaningful language that's relevant to the business that we're working with.
And be aware of culture as well. Be aware who you're talking to and where they're from.
Yeah, there's a whole different webinar on culture, isn't there, and risk culture. But any questions before I close the session and hand back to Steve? I'm not seeing anything pop up in the box. No. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending the session. Steve, thanks ever so much as well for taking the time, and apologies that we had to reschedule this. We did have a Black Swan event, didn't we, Steve, that probably we should have known about. Even as risk managers, we're not infallible. So yes, it was all down to train strikes last week, wasn't it, and disruption to travel plans. But it just goes to show that understanding what's happening around you and looking very broad in terms of what the context of the organisation is really, really key. So Steve, thank you very much. For anybody that would like to follow up on the conversation that we've had this morning, then there are some contact details, I believe, on the last slide. There we go. But otherwise, thank you very much for attending the session. Thank you, and thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks all for being here.